you. Senator Roberts.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for appearing today. Many Australians have heard that getting vaccinated does not stop us from getting COVID, and that if we do get it, we could still infect other people. Is that true?
Yes. Professor Kelly might answer that.
Thank you. What is the risk of being infected by a vaccinated person with COVID compared to an unvaccinated person with COVID?
So just repeat the question.
What is the risk of being infected by a vaccinated person who has COVID compared with an unvaccinated person with COVID?
Well, it's lower. I'm not sure I can give you an exact amount. I think Professor Murphy earlier talked about the issue, and also Senator Colbeck, about the issue of transmission and how the vaccine affects that. We're getting more information, and it seems like there is a definite influence on transmission, decreasing transmission, somewhere between 30 and 60% less likely.
Is that a mass figure, or is that if you had COVID and you were vaccinated compared with if you had COVID and weren't vaccinated, would I have the same risk or lesser risk?
You would have a much lower risk, but it's not zero.
Okay, thank you. What decrease in transmission of infection would stop restrictions such as lockdowns, masks and social distancing?
So that's a matter that we've been charged by we as in Australian Health Protection Principal Committee, of which I chair, by National Cabinet to look at, and so it's a matter for National Cabinet. There will be there's a series of papers that we're preparing exactly to answer those questions. Some have been produced already and presented, and there'll be more in the coming meetings.
Thank you. How many times and how often would each of us need to be injected for the vaccine to be effective? And for each time, for how long does the effect last?
So, as I mentioned earlier in the hearing, very good protection from one dose of vaccine, either the AstraZeneca or Pfizer, particularly in relation to severe infection, but also to symptomatic infection, and to a lesser extent asymptomatic infection. So that's a single dose. The second dose is important for both of those vaccines, and most of the vaccines that are currently being used around the world require 2 doses. To give a longer effect and a more deep effect, if you like, in terms of protection. I think it's very important that Australia knows that this is the start of our vaccine program. It will almost certainly not be the end. There will be a need for boosters into the future, particularly in relation to the variants of concern, of which there are 4 now that have been designated by the World Health Organisation, and some of those we already know do affect the vaccine efficacy. So it's likely we will need to have boosters into the future. How long that 2-dose effect works is still, we don't know. We know it's at least 6 months, because that's the studies have been looking at it for 6 months. It's almost certainly longer than that for the original strain, but the variants of concern adds another complexity to it.
Can you guarantee Australians that all the vaccines you have obtained are 100% safe?
I can't say that they're 100% safe, Senator, no.
I do appreciate your honesty. How many years will it be before we know the long-term and intergenerational effects of these vaccines that only have provisional approval?
I might ask my colleague from the TGA to come up to answer that one.
John Skerritt, Deputy Secretary, Health Products Regulation, also responsible for the TGA. So TGA, unlike the US and the UK, for example, did a provisional approval of vaccines as opposed to an emergency use authorisation. The reason why it is a provisional approval is because we don't have, for example, as Professor Kelly has just said, information on the duration of protection from these vaccines. And we require the companies to give us that sort of information in the coming years. I mean, no one has those answers now. There's some encouraging results, but as Professor Kelly has said, it's likely that further vaccinations will be required. As part of the approval of any medicine or vaccine, the company, together with us, are involved in very extensive safety monitoring. And we publish the results of the safety monitoring of that vaccine every week, including mild or 24-hour adverse events right through to those that might be much more serious and require hospitalisation. And no medicine or vaccine is without adverse events, but on balance, the number of adverse events, especially serious adverse events for these vaccines, are comparatively low. And the overwhelming majority of people vaccinated from them at worst suffer a 24 or 48-hour sore arm or tiredness, fatigue, etc.
So thank you. It's a very comprehensive response. So to summarise, we don't know yet, but you're relying upon the vaccine makers to feed you back information as time moves on.
No, the information on safety comes from a wide range of sources. It comes from the states and territories. For GP vaccination agreements, the GPs make an undertaking to also report any adverse events. The companies are legally bound to report adverse events not only in Australia but also globally. And of course we share, and in fact at 9-10 o'clock tonight we'll be having one of our regular fortnightly video conferences. We share information on adverse events with all the major regulators globally. So, and the final source is from the medical scientific literature. So while the companies have this legal requirement to report, it's only one of a number of inputs to understanding adverse events. And many of our adverse event reports come directly from doctors or even individuals. Any individual can report an adverse event directly to us.
Thank you. Moving on to another topic, away from vaccines for a minute. The vaccine only has provisional approval. Is it true that provisional approval is only possible where there are no approved pharmaceutical treatments available?
Provisional approval is possible where there is not a similar treatment available for that group of patients. And so if there'd been an approved vaccine, but say had been on the market for several years, fully approved, then it wouldn't have been possible to provisionally approve a vaccine. But at the time of the submissions of those vaccines, and indeed we have provisionally designated the Novavax vaccine as well and the Johnson & Johnson or Janssen vaccine, it is possible to provisionally designate and potentially provisionally approve those vaccines.
Thank you. Ivermectin is an antiviral that's been proven safe in 3.6 billion doses, human doses, over 60 years. It's now demonstrating success in treating COVID internationally, including in certain Indian states that are performing far better than the other states without it. Last time you were here, Dr. Murphy and Professor Murphy and Professor Kelly, you acknowledged that cures and preventatives are a fundamental and complementary part of a virus management strategy. What is your timeline for the assessment and use of ivermectin in light of the emerging evidence and its historical safety?
Senator, we have not received a submission for ivermectin for the treatment of COVID. I have had a number of people write to me and say, why haven't you folks approved? We can't make a medicine submission to ourselves for regulatory approval. There's no provision in law for us because it requires a legal sponsor. But we have said to people, if you come with a dossier of information, we will review it as a priority. Now, if you go to the broader community, including the company that is the main originator company that is the sponsor of ivermectin, they do not believe that the overwhelming balance of evidence actually supports that ivermectin being effective in the prophylaxis, or prevention or the treatment of COVID. However, our doctors and scientists would look at that evidence with open eyes. And so it is open for any sponsor to put an application in for ivermectin to the TGA for regulatory approval.
Thank you. Moving back to the vaccine, the government has provided an indemnity to vaccine suppliers, as I understand it, and multinational pharmaceutical companies who have caused harm in the past. What is the nature of the indemnities that the government has provided, and are they full indemnities?
Ms Edwards, I think,
Yep.
is across that.
Just give me a moment. There we go. Sorry, Senator, going to a wholly different part of my folder.
You've got a lot on your plate.
Just to go to your question, I understand it. You're wanting to know exactly the nature of the indemnities provided.
The government's provided to the vaccine manufacturers and suppliers.
So, in the first instance, to say that the actual detail of the indemnities is part of the commercial in confidence contracts, but I can provide you some information about the nature of what's provided. So we've agreed to certain indemnities with the COVID-19 vaccine suppliers. They're contained in commercially confidential contracts. The indemnities are designed to operate if there are problems with the flow on from the vaccines themselves, as opposed to the manner of of administration and so on. They don't cover that. Details of the agreement are commercial in confidence, but nothing in any of the contractual agreements from individual companies would stop individuals from seeking to litigate, should an individual seek to do so in the future.
Sorry, could you repeat that again, please?
So the actual detail of the indemnity, it relates to the nature of the vaccine itself as opposed to the manner of administration or any other issue to do with how it's transported and so on. But it is absolutely the case that nothing in the indemnities prevents an individual from taking an action against the manufacturer or against anybody if there's an issue that arises from the impact of the vaccine. So in the summary of the arrangements are that they ensure that manufacturers have the significant indemnities in place to allow them to come into the marketplace and provides protection, but they don't prevent any action being taken by an individual who might be affected by a vaccine.
So what would they be? Why would they need an indemnity if they can still be sued? I don't understand that.
Well,
I'm not a lawyer, but
I was once, but it's a long time ago.
you became honest, did you? No, we've got
Always been
lawyers,
honest,
good friends.
Senator.
We've got good friends.
Always been
That was
honest.
from Murray Watts' ears.
So no one's saying I'm not honest. It's to do with the relationship between the government and the company.
What is the nature of that relationship?
Well, those are the things that are confidential in the contracts. You'd appreciate in order to get these vaccines into Australia so that we have access to them, there are strict requirements in the way the contracts are done with the companies and confidentiality, and the nature of the indemnities are part of that confidentiality.
In the event of an injury or death from the vaccine, who pays compensation?
Not a question I can answer in the abstract. It would depend on the circumstances and so on and how the legal process would go on. As I say, the indemnities with the manufacturers relate only to the flow on from the vaccine itself. So in the event that negligence happens in any mechanism, then it could be actionable against the person who'd done the negligence, but there's no simple answer to who pays compensation because compensation would have to be found to be payable and attributable to someone and so on.
So it'd be pretty challenging, Ms Edwards, for an individual to sue that they've just lost their house, their spouse or their son or daughter, because I just go through some of the settlements in the past, or some of the fines. Pfizer has paid the second largest pharmaceutical settlement in history, $2.3 billion in 2009, off-label promotion and kickbacks, plus $430 million US in 2004 for off-label promotion. AstraZeneca has paid $520 million US in 2010, off-label promotion and kickbacks, and $355 million US in 2003 for Medicare fraud. Johnson & Johnson has paid $2.2 billion US in 2013 for off-label promotion and kickbacks, plus millions in Australia last year for defective pelvic mesh implants. It'd be a pretty brave person that would hope to get anything out of this if they tried to sue any of these companies. These guys have a history of dodging.
Well, I'm not aware of any of the instances you're referring to, but clearly there have been instances in which action has been taken against these companies.
Are these companies appropriate to be entered into an agreement in this way? I mean, look at the history.
So the Australian government and Australian consumers have the advantage of pharmaceutical products produced by companies such as these and many others. Obviously enormously important to the health of Australians that they have access to medicines, including vaccines. We rely heavily on the scientific advice from the CMO, from the TGA and from experts as to what is the appropriate vaccine to be approved and used in the country, and those are the vaccines which we have purchased and are administering.
Senator, I think perhaps I might throw to Skerritt in relation to this. I mean, the approvals for the vaccines have been based on a considerable amount of data. The approvals haven't been provided lightly, and we have had the advantage of the visibility of the application of the vaccines in a number of other jurisdictions. So it's an important question that you ask, I think, and so it's not a company reputational issue. It's actually the data that supports the application of the vaccines that is assessed by not only our regulatory authorities, but also the regulatory authorities in other jurisdictions, and also the fact that, as has already been indicated, there is a lot of discussion between those authorities in relation to that data. So it's interrogated as a part of the approval process, not only in this jurisdiction but in others. And
I understand it's been. Perhaps you could also include reference to this, Dr. Skerritt.
Thank you.
That
Thank
some
you.
of the overseas nations that are using these vaccines have suspended their use.
Well, there's several questions. I'll return to suspension of use, although it's been relatively limited in countries like Norway. But to talk about those fines for companies, I should clarify that it's a consequence of one of the things that personally I hope Australia never follows, and this is the US widespread advertising directly to the public of prescription medicines. And it is legal and extremely commonplace. You only have to have the TV on for 5 minutes in your hotel room to see an advertisement for prescription medicine in the United States. And however, it is tempting for some of these companies, and they've been found with major fines from court cases, when they push for sorts of conditions, what we call the indications for which a medicine is approved. So a medicine may be approved for certain sorts of arthritis, and their marketing people think it's a great idea to talk about arthritis in general. And that's where they get these multi-$100 million fines. So if you go into those cases in the US, it's not about them providing defective vaccines or cheating with their quality data or cheating with their clinical data. Almost all those cases come down to inappropriate promotion because of the temptation the United States systems offers of allowing to advertise prescription medicines directly to the public. Now, thank God we don't have that system in this country.
That's still a matter of ethics, though, isn't it? The companies are pushing that. It's their marketing people they employ.
It's their marketing people, and of course we could mention many well-known Australian corporations who have also had challenges with marketing, including of telecommunication services. Now,
but they also go to the essence of integrity of the company.
But in Australia, we do look closely at promotion, including to doctors. So recently, we fined a particular company over $300,000 for what we concluded was inappropriate promotion of opiates to doctors. This wasn't to the general public, but it was still inappropriate in our view. So we will take action if we believe promotion of a product is inappropriate. Now, talking about companies and countries that have suspended vaccines, there were a number of short-term suspensions of vaccines, for example, when some deaths in aged care were reported very early in the new year. They were then lifted after further investigation, where it was found that, sadly, people die in aged care and the death rates were not all that different from the expected death rates. There were then short-term suspensions in some countries after the initial clotting cases were found at AstraZeneca. In most countries, although Norway, for example, is an exception, most countries have reintroduced those vaccines, but like Australia, many of them have age recommendations, and those ages vary between countries.
Thank you.
Senator Roberts, we've just run out of time, so we've got one more question.
Okay. After the TGA had already provisionally approved the AstraZeneca vaccine, Minister Hunt said of the vaccines, quote, "The world is engaged in the largest clinical trial, the largest global vaccination trial ever. Australians later died of blood clots due to the vaccine, a side effect that was not known prior to provisional approval. Why should Australians be the lab rats of a drug trial?"
So the word trial really, the treatment of COVID, and none of us has a crystal ball. Where we will end up, whether it's opening borders or changes to the way we live our lives in a year or two, is probably one of the biggest societal trials we've had since World War II. So it's true to say that because we don't know whether vaccines are 100%, 90%, 80%, 70%, 50%, 60% in preventing transmission, because we don't know about the duration of protection, all those things, it is a trial in the sense that anything is new. So that was a context, if you look at the wider context in which the Minister made those comments. Now, on the issue of benefit versus risk, every medicine or vaccine has significant risks. There's been many dozen deaths due to Panadol in this country. And yet, if we didn't have that drug for for relief of simple fever and so forth, there'd be a lot of people suffering. And so every medicine has its benefits and its risks. Now, because the clotting thing is very rare, even though the trials were extremely large as trials go, 20, 30,000 people, and there's been another 30,000 people in a follow-up trial of the AstraZeneca, those numbers were still too low that you would predict something that would be seen 10 in a million times. And so that's why the clotting thing was not picked up.
Isn't there still something really big outstanding, though, and that is that these are an RNA vaccine?
No, the AstraZeneca vaccine
some of them, sorry, are RNA.
Vaccine. Yeah.
How long before we know the intergenerational effects?
There's no evidence at all from animal or human studies that the RNA vaccines, if you're talking about them, incorporate into the genetic material of human beings. They wouldn't have been approved for regulatory approval, and that includes by much bigger regulators such as FDA, if these bits of mRNA incorporated into the human genetic material. In fact, medicines that incorporate into human genetic material and are inherited are currently not permitted in most major countries, including Australia.
So what you're saying is that it is okay to have a few deaths?
Well, I'm saying that every medicine or vaccine is assessed both before it goes onto the market and once it's on the market based on benefit and risk. And in Australia, we've had, sadly, one death. We've had a number of cases of this clotting syndrome, but the really encouraging thing is that many of our cases seem to be milder than in other countries. And that's because there's such widespread awareness, and these cases are picked up early. They're put in hospitals, even if it's minor clotting. And the really good news is that the overwhelming majority of those people are already out of hospital.
Thank you, Chair.